and welcome to today's episode of Bold Brand British, where we spotlight the voices and stories often unheard or overlooked, particularly from South Asian and immigrant communities. I'm your host, Karina, and today we have a really special guest joining us for what promises to be an eye-opening and deeply honest conversation. Our guest today is Varuni Sinha, a New York-based writer and multimedia producer who has spent years sharing the untold stories of immigrants through her work. Her memoir, Golden Handcuffs, is a powerful account of the silent struggles that we, especially as South Asian women, face as immigrants in America, and experiences often overshadowed in mainstream discussions. Personally, I find her stories a stark reminder of the real life challenges, from the oppressive laws to daily microaggressions that often hold many immigrants back in a society that paradoxically relies on their contributions. So whether it's an isolation that impacts mental health, the constant feeling of being othered, or the restrictions on work and rights, her experience resonates with the struggles of countless immigrants trying to find their footing in a place that isn't always welcoming. So today we'll be diving into some key topics that Varuni is really passionate about, and what it really means to kind of leave behind home to find home and still have home in both places, essentially. So firstly, Varuni, welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Hi, Karina. I'm so happy to be with you today. Yeah.
So before we kind of get started on the kind of questions themselves, can you give us an introduction into you and your kind of story, so to speak?
Sure. I've worked as a writer. That's primarily who I am. I worked as a copywriter in the field of advertising when I was 21. I'm 38 years old now. So that was my first career in India. And I worked for these big brands like Yamaha, Panasonic, Alstom, and things like that. Loved the world of advertising. Um, but then switched gears very quickly to academia to impress my dad, both my parents academics. And I did teach literature at the University of Delhi. I taught the Harlem Renaissance, race and politics through literature, and things like that. Of course, I taught all those subjects without actually understanding deeply the context of it, which I only experienced years later when it became my lived reality in America, especially in New York. And in America, I have worked as a journalist. I've worked for different magazines and things like that, websites and all that. But the work that I'm really proud of is this memoir that I've written. It's called Golden Handcuffs: An Immigrant's Pursuit of Happiness. And it's the first time a South Asian woman is actually penning down her story as an autobiography, chronicling what immigrant women have essentially been through since the year 1990, which has defined their existence, so to say. And you can understand that their voices have been silenced, and they themselves have been silenced by their families. So they were hesitant to talk about it, or writing a book about it, of course, for me was also a very healing part of my journey. So yeah, I wrote the book to offer a message of hope and also a message of love in times in America as well as around the world, where we find ourselves completely torn apart. Yeah.
I can imagine. I completely understand this feeling of wanting to write something that really resonates, and kind of wanting in especially in literature, and whether that be stories or poetry or whatever creative writing there is, not kind of feeling like you're being a bit othered, and feeling like, where is the true representation of somebody that's kind of in between worlds? I call it the kind of hyphen that holds that worlds together, where you're kind of neither here nor there, and but kind of both at the same time. So I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out, because one of my goals of writing this book was to also spread a universal message. Because when you try to like pigeonhole yourself as just this brown immigrant voice, then you are just, then you also kind of just look at the world from that sort of angle. And what I have been happily surprised by, is that the people who are picking up this book, they are from across ethnicities, and across, like, even in terms of professions. know somebody in Boston who's an advertising executive, to a single mom in Brooklyn, to, a person who's a doctor, and like across genders as well, because I thought I'm writing a book for women, and it actually reads, most of it reads like a very endearing love story, which audiences might love, right? And but then it goes through the real ups and downs of what being an immigrant, or anyone who goes against anything in life, which kind of puts them in a situation where they feel that there is no way out, right? How you go beyond that point of no return. So I guess because of that sort of a message, which is more broad spectrum, even though it comes from my experience, I think I'm very surprised, happily surprised, that it's reaching people across. Yeah.
Yeah. And talking on the topic of kind of immigration, so immigration from so-called kind of air quote shithole countries has been a controversial phrase, I think, that's really been kind of thrown around. What do you think it truly means for somebody to have to leave everything behind for unfamiliar shores, and how do you think it affects identity?
Sure. So first of all, when that term was used, right, it was used specifically to refer to countries I think it was used for African nations,
Mhm.
Haiti and El Salvador. So if you look at the history of immigration in America, it came about in certain waves, and initially the preference was given to European countries.
Mhm.
So, most of the immigration, I live in New York, even when I went to Ellis Island, and the museum there documents the stories of immigrants coming in. Those are mostly Europeans who were coming in. And there were laws which were in place, like there was in 1917, there was a Asiatic Barred Zone Act, which kind of completely did not allow immigration from all of Asia, barring Philippines, which at that point was a colony of America. And then in 1924, there was another immigration act which kind of created these quotas, which essentially capped it at 2% of what the population of that nation was already present in America. So 2% of that would be allowed to immigrate from that country. So essentially, if Europeans had been there longer, so they got, and their populations are smaller in size, right? So 2% of a smaller size population would still allow a bigger influx of Europeans to come in. And yeah, so because of that, yes, South Asians have been stuck in, currently the cap is 7% of like huge populations, right? So you can imagine that a lot of people are stuck in that sort of limbo for a very, very long period of time. So when shithole countries or any disparaging term is used, you have to understand there's a context of race. There's a context of also parts of the world or countries which are considered to be like more progressive, as opposed to other nations or ethnicities which are considered to be quote unquote barbaric and things like that, which has a racial history, right? So you cannot ignore that. Um, and as for like, leaving everything familiar and going into another world, I can tell you that I have a lot of respect now for people who are immigrants, no matter how they're represented or misrepresented around the world, especially first generation. You essentially are a superhero because you have to let go of everything, the way you speak, the way you dress, the way you're looked at, right? All of those things, you can pretty much, you have to throw it out the window, because when you come to a new land, you have to invent yourself from absolute zero. And this is true of all economic classes as well. So
Mm.
you could, and that's why there are stories of people who could be doctors or businessmen and blah, blah, blah. And they come to America and they open a laundromat. And then that laundromat becomes a really successful business, right? Uh, Basically, yeah, everything that you knew, you cannot lean upon that at all, because that will only become a clutch for you, and it will not serve any purpose. Like, for example, in my case as a writer, I grew up in New Delhi. I came from a very privileged family, I would say. My parents are both, they've had an intercaste marriage, but they still are the higher castes of
Mhm.
India. So that is privilege. I understand that. My parents were both professors. You know, I was educated. I went to good universities. That is privilege. Um, but when I worked in advertising and I taught at the university, I was still delving in Indian English, which is basically influenced by British English, right? And that's a completely different language. When I came to America and I tried to carve my way as a writer, my British English or Indian English was actually an impediment. And I actually struggled really hard because certain phrases do not exist in American English, which we are used to. So I had to completely change my way of writing. And it was very hard to kind of reinvent myself because if you think of it, it's English, but it's a different kind of English, and you have to also find employment. Nobody's going to,
No,
uh,
give
yeah,
it to you. Yeah.
just hand it to you, right? Yeah. So I had to let go of all of that because it was holding me back in order to be truly open to criticism, which is essential to become a good writer.
Yeah, and you kind of started kind of touching on it slightly, but what do you think the kind of emotional toll that comes with being labeled as an immigrant, particularly when these labels, I think, or when the label immigrant is used, it's rarely used in a positive connotation. It always has a negative connotation to it. And so what do you think the emotional toll of that is on somebody?
I think it happens in two ways. It happens within your community, and it also happens outside your community. Because of the world that we exist in, where every time, not only just in America, but also if you look at the United Kingdom or we look at other countries, especially during the times of elections, right? Immigrants become easy scapegoats in terms of blaming anything on them in order to kind of distract the voters on the ground from looking at real important issues which would be more concerning to them. So we are just scapegoats. Nobody's actually trying to focus on real studies. That never really actually happens. Um, the emotional toll of this is like, I'll tell you what happened to me. Like, I found that as a first generation immigrant, I try to lean on my community, but there is a lot of fierce competition which almost happens because within your community, because you all are essentially trying to survive in, say, a foreign, like an alien world, right? And you all know as little as the next person. And somehow the people, the generations before me, right? They tend to have a very patronizing attitude because once they get their green cards or citizenships and things like that, they don't want to concern themselves with any so-called problem, So new immigrants are often seen as fobs or like fresh off the boat by their own communities.
Yep.
In fact, I found very little support from people from fellow Indians. Surprisingly, I found more support from like Pakistani taxi drivers who, like, when I was going for my first job, like internship, to time out New York, I was like, didn't even know how to catch a cab. And this guy really helped me, So you would find more help from immigrants from other communities, right? Than ironically you expect from your own community members. So that happens. And also, I guess when you just familiarity creates like breeds contempt. So in a way, like this other girl who became my friend, she was a housewife from from Pakistan, and she and I connected. Like we come from very different backgrounds, but somehow we both, we just live very close to each other. So she told me this, and she said that when she relies on, she was from the Sindhi community, and when she relied on other women in her community, they would constantly like tell her what to do, what not to do, in a very patronizing tone. As opposed to that, she kind of found her friendship with me more like sort of, she could say what she wants without thinking that she'll be judged, you know so that tends to also happen. But I did change how I used to make my hair. I did change, like I used to wear like a lot of kajal. um, that went completely out. So my entire fashion sense kind of like just completely changed. I could not just wear, I used to do a lot of ethnic dresses back home in India, and big like earrings and things like that, which I thought were really cool. But when I wore those kind of things in Michigan, where I actually went first before New York, that's where I lived initially, um, the first year of my immigrant journey, people would actually assume that I could not speak English, or even at the grocery store, they would speak very slowly. So there are these perceptions which do exist. And I think that's a very normal human tendency as well, right? Like when I was in, yeah, when I was in India, I used to think all of America is going to be either New York or California. That's not the case, right? So
Yeah,
I was,
I find
yeah,
this really fascinating. Like as an immigrant, like British Bengali myself,
yeah,
I find this concept of there's kind of two aspects of this idea of fresh off the boat fob
yeah,
fascinating because like my thing is everybody is fresh off the boat and to some degree or the other. We
yeah,
all are, right? It's just in various degrees. So how are we looking down on somebody or kind of idolizing others? Like who's making these rules? And it seems to me you're right, like it is our own communities are making these rules, and that's the bizarrest part. But you mentioned like wearing the big earrings, and it's a new concept that I've been kind of playing with because it's kind of come back in fashion now, right? Like to wear jhumkas, and now it's like trendy and it's hip, hipster, and I'm, doing the oiled hair, and I'm like, where was this when we were made fun of? Like I could bring in a curry, and now it's, especially in British communities, it's
yeah.
oh yeah, we're all gonna go for a curry with a pint, at the end of a work day, or like, yeah, I'm wearing these festival earrings, which are just jhumkas, which I'm like, it really baffles me when if we as the South Asian community are doing it, there is that perception of, oh, she won't know English, she won't be able to do this.
Yeah.
But if somebody with lighter skin, and colorism comes into it too, but like lighter skin is wearing it, suddenly it's like, oh, she's so cultured, she's so well traveled. And I'm like, yeah, I find it fascinating, this kind of juxtaposition between the two.
Yeah, it's also like, for example, veganism and yoga, right?
Oh,
So back home, like I could go to a yoga studio, which was very cheap, very cheap. Like it was like 10 rupees a month. You can imagine how much that's in dollars. That's hardly anything.
yeah,
Yoga wasn't cool back then, so I didn't give a damn about yoga. When I started living in Brooklyn and parts of Brooklyn where, like Williamsburg, where there are these fancy yoga studios, right? And I'm like, now I was like more appreciative. I'm critical of myself, more appreciative of yoga, of meditation, as well as veganism. And my mother was shocked. She was like, all along you had these options available to you. So I guess it's also like a post-colonial hangover,
oh, 100%,
yeah,
yeah,
we also like I did notice that like for example, I'm from the bigger cities of India, right? So I did not have a chip on the shoulder when it came to how I spoke. I did not try to change my accent, but I did notice that immigrants from other parts of India, when they came like to America, I noticed how quickly they switched their accents and so brilliantly. And I was like, why don't you own how you speak? But I could also understand that some of them, they just wanted the facility of communication because, many times you just get tired of constantly having to repeat yourself because, they would tell me that they would say, like, even like people in medical professions and things like that, talking to a patient, and then the patient is very rude to a doctor saying, sorry, can you repeat that again? Sorry, we speak English in this country. You know what I'm saying?
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's very demeaning. So for them, it's like adaptation. So I have noticed these two things in my community, which is also when they would cook, right? Cooking food, like we cook with a lot of spices. So the cooking area would be kept so far away from their clothes,
yeah,
uh, their wardrobes, because the stigma of smelling like turmeric is a real thing in our community. And
yeah,
I was like, you should not feel ashamed of that. But I can also understand that if someone picks on that, right, in a way which is very indelicate, that can cause hurt, that can
yeah.
make them feel ashamed. So
And
I
it's
think,
survival, right? Like
yeah,
to a large degree, sometimes it is just survival, and I understand that, but I think my criticism comes to the people that are actually doing the judging, right? Like it's not the people that are changing themselves to try and just survive in a really scary, often, like they don't know the rules. Sometimes they don't even know the language, as you said, even subtleties of Indian English versus American English versus Australian English or British English. Like there's so much nuances within that. But
yeah,
also there are people that, like I think particularly women that get married after they're coming here and they don't know the language, like they're not coming from that privileged place. And it's scary. It's really, really unknown. And I completely understand them being like, you know what, screw it. Like it's not worth the battle. But I find it fascinating that it's the judgment coming from people that have been through that and kind of then will other the same group.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I find really,
Yeah,
really
the first person who
interesting.
called me a fob was actually a college friend who'd already been in America for close to about 8 or 9 years. And I went on a dinner, like I went to have dinner with her and my husband. I wanted her to meet my husband, and she was trying to like be very bitchy and call me a fob because I didn't understand, how Manhattan has different neighborhoods like Soho, this, that, and the other. I mean, I was quite new to the country. I was still trying to figure out how to even get a job, and here she was making fun of me, and that's, I think, that's below the belt. And this is what we do, like this is not great human behavior. It
No,
isn't. Not classy at all, even if she or anybody thinks that is classy. Yeah, you're
yeah.
right.
In your memoir, you describe the sense of being silently endured, right? Could you share some of the ways in which this silence manifests, particularly within community? And I guess I'm thinking of it from a focus of mental health.
Yeah. So my book is essentially really the story of what I experienced on my spousal visa. So when I came here to America, I had a job, I had a completely full life in India.
Mm,
The only thing was that I had been very unsuccessful in finding love,
mm,
and had like the dating game exists in India the way it does in the West. And I had hit a point where I kept running into certain kinds of people who were not healthy in terms of I was always dating narcissists, maybe. And like my husband was here in similar shoes, and he was running into the same thing. And we happened to meet and connect online. And then we dated for like close to about 2.5 to 3 years, at which point one of us had to move. And it's then that I decided that I'll take the plunge. At that time, I was also in academics and I really was missing the world of writing. So I thought if I came to America, I would give writing another real shot. So he was very impressed by my ambition. He himself is a very ambitious man. He's a very hardworking doctor, came from a very poor family in India, um, and made his way to, a success here in America, completely self-made man with nobody helping him. So we both came. I mean, I guess I was attracted to his honesty. He is what he is, very humble, down-to-earth guy. And he was, I think he found it endearing that I did not look at him as this guy who offered things. Like, I just looked at him as a human being. I didn't see him as a doctor, so to say. And so when I took that decision, he told me that unfortunately, the spousal visa does not allow working rights for women. And I would never want you to come here, not knowing that this exists. And this law had existed since 1990 in America, and it did not allow, these women to, it just allowed these women to kind of like stay with their husbands. They did not have the way the law existed in its original format. They did not have a social security number. They could not even have an independent bank account, or if the husband was controlling, they could not even learn how to drive, have an,
yeah,
a driver's license. So it's very restrictive. Uh, but so my husband told me that I get married in 2013. The law still existed in many of its original sort of frameworks. There was a few changes, but it completely changed in 2015. I didn't know that was going to happen. Um, so when I was coming in, he told me that when you come in, I would have you just go back and come back independent of me as a student. So you'll basically come here, you'll apply to universities, try to get into the best programs out there for you, and then go back and come back as a student so that I never feel that I'm controlling you. I don't
yeah,
want to ever. So that was my journey. Unfortunately, however, um, when that did happen, initially I did really well, got into one of the finest schools of journalism, got some great internships at places like Time Out and Guggenheim, got a job before even my classmates did, because I was married to a guy who was raised by a tiger mom, who,
Right.
and so he himself is he doles out tough love. So I
Yeah.
didn't have an option to fail. So I was trying so hard. I've never worked so hard in my life. So I was getting everything, just
Done. Yeah.
yeah, done. But at a time, like this, in America that we see, there's elections and things like that. I lost my job because I got played uh, into the hands of, basically I was doing well, but I was threatening certain people, especially my immediate senior. I was getting gaslighted. And before I knew it, I literally walked into a trap. And despite having a very great working relationship with my editor in chief and the CEO, I was misrepresented by this person in between. And there is no way you can actually prove that. And writing is very subjective. So I lost my job. And in order to still be able to stay with my husband, who was my only family, right? Uh, I had to switch to the spousal visa. And even though the law had changed, the stigma related to the job, to that spousal visa had not changed. So I really, really struggled to find a job. And by that, I mean that 1 year of constantly applying in every which way you can imagine, whether it's networking, whether it's, online applications or in person or all the things, trying to solve this as a real problem, just trying to get a basic job, not even something fancy in the world of writing. I I literally got shown the door just every time they would ask me questions specifically pertaining to my visa, not related to my talents or everything that I had already published. Uh, so 1 year turns to 2 years, turns to 3 years, turns to an absolute state of mayhem that I find myself, because my worth in my eyes was as a working woman. If I lose that identity, I don't know what to do with myself. And so the mental health challenges that I faced were extremely brutal, because I literally, before the lockdown, I locked myself in my apartment for, I think it started with 1 or 2 years and it extended to 3 or 4. And it was a very dark period for me and for even our marriage, where I completely turned against my husband, and sort of blamed him for having brought this upon us, because you can't be on a spousal visa without a spouse. So when I decided to write this book later on, I'm actually kind of shining a light on what not only I, but at least 500,000, if not more, South Asian women have gone through and endured, too scared to talk about it, because they're also kind of just, held back by shame that this sort of darkness brought upon them. Yeah.
And sticking to the kind of labor, economic, societal theme, I guess,
Yeah.
what would your response be to people that argue that immigrants are taking away jobs from local population?
Yeah. So basically, I studied this in terms of, is this actually happening, right?
Mhm.
And I wanted to study this specifically in terms of my immigrant category, because there are different categories.
Of course.
So with the South Asian women, right, who were not allowed to work, that was the logic that was given, that the reason why we're doing this is so that, American jobs go to American people. But when the law was changed in 2015, a small percentage of these women, they were legally allowed to work as long as the husband had fulfilled certain steps in the green card application process. And even then, with huge career gaps, many of these women had already given up on the idea of ever working. They were just like, fuck it, they're not going to do this,
Yeah.
right? Because they'd forcefully become housewives, and they kind of just accepted it, right? But there was still one part of the law which now allowed them to kind of, even if they didn't want to, like, say, work for somebody else, they could work for themselves. So
Right.
there is a small significant number that started opening businesses because they really wanted to get out of the situation that they were in. So
Mhm.
the Cato Institute is an organization which studied what was the cumulative advantage of these H4 spouses and how much they generated, right? So cumulatively, they actually benefited the economy by 7.5 billion. So if they were all able, if they all just got up and left, and I'm just talking about these spouses, right?
Yeah.
Just the wives, mostly they're women,
Yeah.
that would actually shrink the economy by 7.5 billion. And most of these jobs, they don't necessarily go to Indians. they would, like, if suppose they opened a restaurant, they would employ other Americans,
Yeah,
right?
of course.
So it was so whenever such a scene is painted, right, where jobs are being stolen and things like that, I think people should immediately identify that as fear mongering, which is being created to distract from something that the population needs to look at in terms of real answers that politicians need to answer to their own people. That is what they should look at. They should not get distracted by the fear mongering, because these studies have been done far and plenty. And, like I told you, this is just in my community, but you would see across the board that a lot of immigrants have also become entrepreneurs, because
Yeah.
when basically everything, your legs are it's literally like your legs are being chopped off, your hands are being, like, figuratively, like, you're being given very little freedom to actually work for somebody else, and you're still very desperate to succeed at any cost. You're actually creating a perfect situation for an intelligent, hardworking person to somehow figure out how to set up their own business. And that is why a lot of immigrants have been able to, in spite of extreme restrictions, been able to set up businesses which have then gone on to become huge empires.
Yeah, and there's kind of two parts to this, so I'll touch on both, but I want to kind of go on this idea of cutting off the hands and feet. You discuss this idea of a real life Handmaid's Tale that kind of plays out for legal immigrants. How does the immigration system in America restrict the lives of South Asian women in particular? You've kind of touched on a little bit of it with the spousal visa, but yeah, if there's anything more you want to add.
I think what happens is that these women who were marrying these men,
Mhm.
right? And I'm talking about doctors, engineers, lawyers. These were the people who were imported by America in 1990. Highly skilled, intelligent folks who were brought in to kind of set up industries here, whether it was in the health sector, whether it was research in NASA, or the IT sector, right? Prior to that, a lot of these immigrants who were brought in from our community or elsewhere, uh, there was a class of visas called the H class. These people were mostly temporary workers, so they could not stay here beyond, say, a couple of months. If you're staying in another country far away from home for a couple of months, it would be too much money spent to even try and bring your family, which includes your wives or parents, or yeah, so they wouldn't do that. In fact, there were certain laws which actually did not allow many of them to do that. But when they decided to bring in, like, doctors or engineers, right, to actually build sectors which would involve constant work for years, like 3 years at least, they could not do that anymore, because then it's not lucrative enough to bring somebody who's that intelligent, because then that person would look for opportunities in their own country or elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
So it was kind of touted as like a family reunification program where, hey, we are now letting you bring your spouses, you know. But of course, these men, when they had married these women, a doctor would, like, marry somebody who's also intelligent and hard work, but natural, right? So doctors were married to doctors, or even if you have a teacher, like, they could be married to another teacher, or like things like that. So they were naturally attracted to intelligence. It's just but
Yeah.
natural, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like for like. Yeah.
Yeah, so they and it's just that there was not much information back then. So many of these women who were highly skilled and as ambitious and able, and in fact, they were working back home when they immigrated, right? Like, so when you actually go to America, the way it's seen as by the rest of the people in your country is that, oh, wow, she's going to America, her life's a fairy tale, right? It was instantly seen as this NRI, marriages were seen as fairy tales, or like Disney,
Yeah.
like a Disney movie sort of a reality. So when they came here, they were not aware that actually, in reality, they would not have any right to work. And while that is perfectly fine if you've grown up to be a homemaker, and there's nothing wrong in being a homemaker, but if you grew up with the idea of doing something more with your life, like I did, I'm sure you did, I'm sure a lot of women these days do, uh, then and then you're being told that, I'm sorry, you have to stay at home, that can cause that can feel like suicide, because then you're like, I'm sorry, so I'm supposed to stay at home and do what? You're supposed to, so the logic which was often given to these women was, what are you even complaining about? You have more than enough. Your husband's earning more than enough. Just you're living in a nice house, have kids, right? Or like go shopping, or so these women were silenced by a logic which was actually used at the time of the Victorian age, where women were basically just tied to an estate, and their job was just be an angel in the house who's supposed to just take care of kids. And if she tried to say anything else or tried to talk about her problems, she's hysterical, and she was actually considered a mad woman who could be institutionally locked up, right? So these women, though it's not, I'm talking about highly educated women who were forced to become housewives. They actually went through something which is so dark, but because their numbers are not huge, they're not millions and millions, it's 500,000, right? Uh, they almost felt that, what's the point? I might as well endure it. So the marriages they many of these marriages did not even survive. I know, yeah, they did not survive. In fact, I was very close to completely setting fire to my marriage, because I I did not see the point of uh, you know literally carrying on with life if all I have to do is stay at home. And even though I went outside and tried so hard, the opportunities seemed to be there, but I could not even get a basic job. Uh, so it is pretty dark. But if you look at, even if you were to ignore this category of women, these highly educated women, I think even for others, the world shrinks from because back home in India or in South Asian countries, there's a lot of community. There's a lot of your neighbors, your entire village, people in your city. As an immigrant, it just becomes very, you just kind of are forced, because now you're completely dependent on the man who has brought you to this foreign land. So you're completely dependent on his sort of networks. So your world shrinks to the domain of your house. And however, the world outside for the average European woman or American woman is not like that, right?
It's
They're going,
expanding.
yeah, they can do whatever they want. So it almost feels like you're a handmaiden. It feels like that. And in fact, when I watched that entire The Handmaid's Tale, I felt that that's exactly my story. I can feel that person's pain, you know?
And it leads to isolation, doesn't it? How do
Yes.
you think this isolation impacts the mental health, especially for women of color? And you made the parallel between kind of women of color, the kind of Meghan Markle story. So I'm really kind of interested to what that means for you.
Yeah, so there's one aspect of it is the silencing. The silencing happened to me from my own community, because talking about your mental health problems, even talking about something like a miscarriage, is very discouraged in South Asian communities. And especially if you go out there and you want to write a book about something that might bring shame to your family or might bring too much attention to your husband's career, then you would be seen as an absolute witch in South Asian communities. So for me, every time I try to tell someone that I'm trying to write a book on this topic, the backlash that I got was more from, you know, folks who were telling
Okay,
me,
thank you.
yeah, just be quiet. Don't draw too much attention to yourself, even if you want to write a story that is full of love and hope, right? But in terms of Meghan Markle, I would say that when we look at Meghan Markle, right, as a cultural, let's look at her as a cultural sort of symbol. Many people may not like what she is, what she's about, right? You have to and I would say that this is not about liking or disliking her. Let's just keep that aside for now, and let's just look at her as this woman who is being harassed by media across the board, right? And who is one person, one individual against an entire institution, which is the crown, right? And the crown is this, and all of the media that is bullying her into having us believe that she's a narcissist, that she is a social climber, that she is somebody who has fractured the family, right, by taking Harry away as though Harry doesn't have a brain or will of his own, right? So, whether we like her or not, she used all that hate which was directed against her, but to create a platform to tell stories that actually challenge white supremacy, that challenge the crown, which is actually a symbol of colonialism. How can we even forget that? And she was painted as, like the words that were used to bring her down were pretty, like, like it was not like, it was not hinting towards racism, it was full on racism, where there were photographs of her and Harry and a kid, a chimpanzee kid, or in the press. That is extremely insensitive. Or where she was, quote unquote, represented as an angry Black woman. So if a person talks about their sort of like what they're going through, right, in terms of the oppression, and they raise their voice against that, especially if they're people of color, then, like, the women in the Victorian age, the way they were seen as hysterical and locked up, African American people have, or people in the Black community, have been seen as too dramatic or too angry, right? Without understanding that where is that anger coming from? If it is anger and if it's out of control, let's try and understand why it's out of control. Because
Yeah.
every opportunity for them to voice very serious problems
Silenced. Yeah.
has been taken away. Um, and I think that when Meghan Markle was talking about, that she went through a period of suicidal ideation, right? I could totally understand that, because during that time, not too far ago for me, I was actually living in a very fancy apartment with my husband. Because for me, money, what I want people to understand is that money was never a problem here, because I'm
Yeah.
married to a doctor. So that is what that was the same logic which was used for me. She was told that she's a princess. What is she crying about, right? Just suck it up and move on. I was told the same thing. And I was literally staying in this fancy apartment in Long Island City, which is in a glass tower. And as soon as you stepped out into the balcony, you would get like this beautiful view of Manhattan. In fact, Chrysler Building was right across. And I was terrified of going into the balcony. Now I understand, after years of therapy, because I was scared that I'll do something to myself.
Yeah.
It was not fully formed, but I was going there. And yeah, so the isolation that she felt, right? Because essentially, if you're part of the crown, you cannot work, right? Um,
So it's almost like weird parallels between the two. Yeah.
I could see the parallels. And to tell you the truth, I'm not a big fan of Meghan Markle, but I'm studying her as another human being who is
Yeah,
being
as what she represents as opposed to
represented.
her as a personality.
Exactly. And I think she is very ballsy and very courageous to have, used that mantle, which was used to destroy her, to actually uplift her and other women. So in that sense, yeah, it's
Yeah.
pretty cool what she's been able to do.
You touched on this idea as well, on this entrepreneurialism, that there is a common belief that immigrants tend to be more innovative. What factors do you think drive this entrepreneur? I can't say this one.
Entrepreneurship. Yeah, it
Thanks.
is. Tongue
Thanks.
twister.
Especially in South Asian immigrant communities.
Yeah. So what I have observed, and I'll give like in the sense, like there was this story which I decided that I'm going to start like a platform where I'm going to share stories, positive stories of immigrants. One of the first few, I'm still building that platform, but the guy who founded WhatsApp, which we use on our phones every day, I think his name's Brian Stanton, and he is from Ukraine. And his story is pretty much the story of every immigrant. And so when he came to America, um, it was actually his mom who was pushing the family and they were very poor. And they basically decided that they need to go to America, because that's what every immigrant believes, that America is the land of opportunities, right? And when they actually came to America, it was very tough for them. I think he was at San Jose State University, and as soon as he comes in, they realized that their father could not somehow join them, and the mother, she gets cancer, and they are so poor that they have to survive on food stamps. These are very extreme conditions in which the boy has to now work as a janitor at a grocery store. He has to still go to university, and he figures out that he has to somehow make it because there is no other way out. And he was very driven because he was in the world of tech, but he was very driven back home in Ukraine. There was very limited privacy in terms of, because of certain, he talks about it in terms of communist controls. They could not openly talk about, it was almost like the government was watching everything everyone was saying or writing about and things like that. And he found that he needed freedom from that sort of an oppressive world. And one of the other problems that he faced when he came here was that he could not talk to anyone back home because calls back then were very expensive. In order to solve the problem that he faced personally, with very little actually financial support that he had, because he was really, really poor, he actually applied himself to create WhatsApp, to create something like that with another fellow college kid, right? That is exactly the story of every immigrant. And that is also the story of one of my friends. Her name's Farah. And she basically, in fact, came to America on a green card. But she, as a Muslim woman, she had faced a lot of discrimination back home in India as well. In fact, I am way more privileged than Farah back in New Delhi. She came from a different part of India, like a smaller town, to Delhi. She figured out how to get into my university. She'd already been through the struggle, but she faced discrimination in my university where she was not even allowed to finish off her PhD, you know? Yeah. And then she came to America after me, and she came on a green card. So she had a much better, like in terms of an immigrant status, she had a better status than me. But whenever she leaned upon like our friends and, to how to even get a job, people don't really help because everybody wants to figure it out for themselves and then just like kind of not help or mislead other people in our own community. So she did go through a time like during which, like me, we both were like not being able to even get a basic job. And we both were highly intelligent women who were in academics, right? Back home in India, we were just like essentially housewives. And we both shared our problems with each other. And one day I think she just joked about it that I would rather go work at a nail studio. And she actually decided to open one. And she now has a nail studio in Long Island. And I'm really proud of her journey. And
Yeah.
like, yeah, I think it's pretty cool. Or like I'm beginning to realize that, as I publish my book, and I've been able to also work with some really big people here in New York and Los Angeles, and just by sheer hard work and by failing and not being given opportunities at all, I have tried to. I've worked for free. I've also like still been able to publish on a constant basis as a freelancer and things like that, just because I wanted my writing to improve. So my goal is essentially to set up like a publishing house or a platform for immigrant voices and voices of color. And I think I'm so driven at this point because of my own hunger, because I was denied the basic opportunities. So now I'm so driven that I'm shocked how driven I am without an external structure of discipline. I now find myself getting up really early in the morning, having a plan, going after my goals in a way that I was not back home when I was very entitled, I would say. So in fact, when my entitlement was stripped away from me and I was put into situations that other immigrants also put into, where nothing will be given to you unless you work super hard, right? And still there's no guarantee of success. I think it's those circumstances which force you, it's almost like a pressure cooker, which force you to become entrepreneurs. And that tends to happen to first generation immigrants because you've already lost so much, you've lost your friends, your family's far away, you just can't get up and leave and go back home.
You've lost your sense of identity, what's normalcy.
Yeah. So in that sense, you just are like, I guess this is what more do I have to lose? So when that fear goes away, in a way, you just, you just tend to go that direction, that route.
Well, as soon as you open that publishing house, you let me know. I will be, like submitting my publications ASAP to that,
There's a lot more I'll have to figure out, but I that's certainly one of my, yeah, one of my goals is to be able to create a platform for, voices on the margins.
You spoke about I guess, the pursuit of happiness, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
How does this differ for immigrants, and what do you think are the kind of obstacles that are standing in our way of achieving happiness and success, particularly for women?
Uh, I think that uh, I think that they have to redefine. We all have to redefine what happiness means, because I can say for myself that what it meant for me when I was in New Delhi is completely different now. For
Yeah.
me, so because you have to sort of completely recreate a version of yourself in a completely different land. Almost think of it as you were a character in a reality TV show, and now the reality TV show has completely changed, and so now you're completely different characters. So in that sense, what defines success, happiness, contentment for you also completely changes. I think in my story, what happened to me once I reached that point of no return, uh, what a very interesting thing happened. I Me and my husband, we could not literally live with each other anymore because the anger and the
Mm.
blame that I was lashing, I was basically lashing at him. And I had also gone down a slippery slope of drinking every day to numb the pain of uh, that darkness. Um, and then at that point, he decided that the only way our marriage could heal was if he stayed in a separate city and I stayed by myself in New York and figured it out. So he went to Los Angeles, I was here. And when he went away, I could not stay in the apartment because it was too isolating. But before he went, however, he got me a dog, like a therapy dog, a golden lab, a very cute, beautiful dog, and he's still very much a part of our family. And then he goes away, trains the dog, goes away, and I don't know what to do. And there's this overactive dog who literally gets me out of the bed
Yeah.
every at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. And this is like a very depressed person who just wants to either sleep or drink,
Yeah.
right? And if I don't take him out, he will start chewing through the furniture, the shoes, everything. So I'm forced to walk outside. So I just start walking outside on the streets of Brooklyn, New York. And as I'm walking on the streets, a very bizarre thing happens to me where randomly people, strangers on the streets, they start talking to me. I hardly approach them. This wasn't like Humans of New York. Uh, this wasn't like I was going out with a camera and interviewing people. Uh, it was essentially like it was that it would start with something which was something sometimes related to my dog, and then it could be a conversation which would be very bizarre at first, where like there were times where this person who came to me and said that he lost all his weight, a really good looking man, he lost all his weight uh, by smelling his shit, right? And I was like, what? So this gorgeous 6 foot tall guy tells me he lost all his weight by, yeah.
Okay.
And then he's like, yeah, because if your shit smells so bad, you're putting disgusting stuff into your body. And then he starts off from there, and he starts then telling me more about his life and more about, things like that. And before I knew it, I was every day out in the streets talking to people who would share highs and lows of their life, relationship problems, everything that they might have gone through, say their mother-in-law. And these were people who belonged to different ethnicities, a white person, a black person, a Mexican person. They could be rich, poor, whatever. And it only happened during that time. It's so strange that it's almost like I became so lonely and so isolated. I think that I kind of was attracting these stories. And I didn't know why these people would talk for so long. At times it would be like 1.5 hours. And I'm like, shit, I wish this person would stop because I need to go home and pee. But they would just go on and on and on. And during that time when I was standing there listening to them, I could understand everything almost as if I could understand everything what they were going through. I did not judge them. In fact, when they would tell me certain things, I would now slowly, I started healing all my pain, my anger, my disgust at my own self and my own situation started going completely away, because I realized that some of these people had had real tragedies. They had lost family members. or they had endured cancer, or they had real financial issues in terms of massive debts that they had accumulated. And here, look at what I was doing. That there was this one thing that was not working in my life, which was that I could not work. And because of that, I was willing to set fire to everything,
Yeah.
to a perfectly, my marriage was otherwise very beautiful. I
Yeah.
was completely turned against my husband. Everything about what I had made zero sense because I focused on that one thing that did not work for me. And so at that point, I had a complete perspective shift, and I decided that I wanted to uh, basically work for the homeless in the city, because a lot of people that I talked to in on the streets were homeless, and they had like so much wisdom. You know, some of them had a lot of wisdom, and these are people who have hardly anything. Were able to, like share a cup of, like I would talk to this guy called Mario, who all he wanted to do, he didn't even want me to buy him a cup of coffee. He got his own coffee, but he wanted me to just sit with him and have a decent conversation. That's
Well,
what he, you know. So that was my source of happiness then, that I wanted to create some sort of social impact or change. So I go to the Bowery Mission, which is an institution in the city, but they tell me that instead of that, they would rather, since they knew that I had a background in writing and art, that I should actually help them create programs for the kids in their community who are at high risk because they live in certain neighborhoods, so
oh,
they're at high risk for um, for trouble that they might get into. So why don't you teach them? So I started teaching those kids, and as I started teaching them, in fact, they taught me more. They healed me more, and so then through that, uh, my entire immigrant journey where I lost myself and then found myself on the other side, my perspective on life has become very different. I give a lot more value to gratitude on a daily basis. Yes, I went through mental health issues, but I give a lot of importance to meditating every day. I don't like necessarily meditate first thing in the morning, but I always meditate for 40 minutes every day. uh, and I used to paint just for as leisure, but now I paint as discipline to actually heal myself, to stay in that state of present moment awareness. So there are a lot of things which my immigrant struggle of losing everything has been able to give me, because now I understand the value of things that we all take for granted. Yeah.
and there's a beautiful synchronicity in this, where you it sounds like it's coming at a time where you're wanting to share your story and wanting to share stories, and here's these people coming to you with stories, and it's almost like I've got all these stories and I've got this passion for wanting to get these stories across and wanting to get my voice across, these voices across, and just write, and they're coming together almost at a kind of clash, but not, and that's there's something very beautiful and haunting at the same time before that.
Yes. Yes, yeah, I realized that when it was happening, in fact, because it was the time of like even the time of elections back then. And I was like, the media and politicians, they're playing a dirty game with human beings,
Mm.
because they're trying to portray that we should hate each other, or that the left should hate the right or the right should hate the left. And in fact, we all are the same, and everybody just needs love. And while it sounds very cliche saying that, that is exactly what I experienced on the streets. These strangers, they healed me. They took away my pain just by sharing their pain. And I, when I was watching the news, constantly stuck to, like what's going on, like who's winning the polls, what are they saying now against immigrants. Now, in fact, for my own mental health, I don't watch so much. I don't consume. I stay up to date because I don't think we should live in an ignorant society. But I have serious boundaries with even consuming media and news, because I don't want it to impact me to such a degree that I don't see that there are human beings that I live around. Otherwise we can look at the world in terms of color. We can look at the world even in terms of like, if it's this political faction, then this is what the human being will be like. Actually, my lived experience has been very different. There have been a lot of people from parts of America who have helped me, you would imagine, or who I would have imagined earlier would be the biggest villains in my life. They are the people who actually helped me write my book, to help, polish it and finesse it. and take it out into the world. So yeah, my own prejudice was also holding me back, and the streets completely wiped that out, the streets of America,
Yeah,
which was a very, very surprising story.
I love that. And from your memoir itself, what message do you want readers to kind of take away?
I think that first of all, uh, whenever we go through any dark time or a very difficult time, I think it's very easy to drown ourselves in greater self-pity and despair, because it just feels so good to have a glass of alcohol and feel like you're this tragic queen or victim of your circumstances.
Mhm.
But actually, everybody has to go through hard times, and sometimes that is the only way your true self will be able to shine, if you're able to push past those difficulties. And no matter what you're going through, no matter what we go through, there was a woman who I met in my like neighborhood, the last apartment I lived in. She had cancer, a very serious cancer, which could come back, she said, if she ever, so every day she keeps herself in a very positive frame of mind. Every single day for her is a battle. Usually in that cancer, I forget which specific one she had, it usually kills the person in just a matter of 2 or 3 years. But she has now been going strong for 11 years, because she said it's all in the mind, and every day we make a choice. So in that sense, hate and love are also a choice, and that's also a cancer. Hate is also a cancer. So even as an immigrant, I would like to tell immigrants that if they're seeing things in the media where they're being misrepresented, and then as a result of that they are feeling angry, or they are feeling that they should be resentful towards other people or whatever, and that can happen, that's very human. I would urge anyone out there, whether you're immigrants or not, to consciously choose love. Don't go towards the cancer of hate, because that's what helped me, and that's what still helps me.
And to
Yeah.
kind of wrap us up, what advice would you give to younger people in migrants or those looking to, migrate that might be either overly optimistic or overly negative about doing so?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because I my husband often, like, we're together, we were able to heal our relationship, and it's been quite a ride. But he often asks me that if you knew that you had to go through so much, would you have actually taken the plunge? I don't know the answer to that. It is a difficult question to answer. But I would say that uh, I was always a hyper optimistic person. I would always try to look at things through, like, it was always rainbows and unicorns. And I think what happens when you do that is that the crash, when you come down to reality, is just a lot more. So I think that it's important for people who are trying to immigrate to other countries to actually make themselves aware of what is the reality on the ground. And still, if you want to do it, I think it's absolutely, you're superheroes for doing that, because you're explorers. You're willing to let go of the familiar, of your family constantly telling you what to do or what not to do. So yeah, go ahead, do that, but inform yourself of what is the reality on the ground, but also be willing to work super hard. And it could go either way. It could go either way. You could, and either way, the journey is it's a journey that will give you something meaningful, whether you succeed or you fail.
And it'll be uniquely yours, I think. I will add,
Exactly.
like it will be uniquely yours. Nobody, you might find aspects that mix with other people's, and you might think, oh, this person also has this experience, that shared and lived experience, but no one's going to have the exact same journey, exact same experiences as you, and that's okay. I think there's a strength in the uniqueness and the strength in the isolation, because I think you're right. Like, I think it does bring out these stories and bring out the voices that otherwise might not have even kind of been like, what, screw it, like, what do I have to lose? I might as well do this or that.
Yes, yes. Each story each immigrant story, even within the same family, like my story and my husband's story, or my friend's story who opened a nail studio, right? Or
Yeah.
somebody else's. It's just every story is so unique. And in that sense, an immigrant journey is worth taking, I would say. Even the person who was talking about from Ukraine, who I remembered his correct name is Brian Acton, not Stanton. He too, he has a very unique story. And I think that, yeah, I think it's just that everything is just taken away from you. Everything that you could hold on to is taken away from you. So now how do you survive in this new world? That's an experiment like cannot be created in any other format, unless you choose to become an immigrant consciously. Yeah.
And where do people find your memoir and your book?
My book, Golden Handcuffs: An Immigrant's Pursuit of Happiness, is on Amazon. It's also on Barnes and Noble. You can also go to my website, varunisinha.com, and you'll find all the information that you need to purchase it.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sitting and coming, like sitting with me. I feel like this is a conversation we could have for hours, you know. So if I'm ever in New York, I will, email you to be like, let's grab a drink.
Absolutely. I would love to. Yeah.
Yeah. All
Thank
right.
you
Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.
too.
Bye.